context. I tend to agree with you, but the context is really quite different. For developed countries, it's really about moving from existing stock, and for emerging markets and developing countries, it's largely about new investment. Okay, that'll make the big difference. I mean, in the case of India, for example, India's energy plan is to go from something like 775 terawatts to about 2,500 in the next, which is like a China-like transformation. So it's huge increase. And certainly, as we heard, that's not going to be based on deep decarbonization. So the question I had is, what would a deep decarbonization plan look like for an emerging market if we are really going to give this some traction in the G20 discussion? The other question I have is for Ritu, which is that, one of the factors, is rapid technological change and uncertainty associated with it. So, in Mexico, several weeks ago, the bid for solar came in at, 2.9 cents a kilowatt hour, which would be really unthinkable, when you think about Germany's experience a few years ago. Now, as was pointed out, renewables have problems, including instability of grids and levelized cost. But the question, as German experience shows, or the German plan show, the target on renewables can be seen in the context of changing technology. So if technological options open up, so that you can have, say, distributed power, where, the sun shining during the day, storing water at night, and compensating for it, for many Indian villages, particularly with the right topography, that might be a very sustainable solution. So the other question I had for you is, you said, so 40% is from non-fossil, 60% from fossil, and as we heard, India is on a rocket trajectory of supercritical thermal plants. But those are coal-based, okay? And that's the worst of the worst. And by the way, the capital costs associated with coal-based is very high, and they are very, very long-lasting. So in a way, they could become the stranded assets of the future. So one of the questions I have is, why is there not more discussion within the fossil fuel mix? Because that's what's happening in Mexico, that's what's happening in many Latin American countries, but you don't see that discussion here in India.
Thank you, Amar. So I'll take one more question. There's a gentleman back there, and then we'll do a second round.
Hello. I am Sharma, retired from the Navy. I just want to share with you that in India, willy-nilly, solar power has been equated with photovoltaic. But other technologies, which are solar thermal technologies, are available where no land is required and thousands of megawatts can be set up at sea. But when we approach the government, those plants' life is about 75 years. And no government, state government or central government, is ready to sign PPA, power purchase agreement, for 75 years. What's the answer, and how you have solved this thing in Germany?
Thomas, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you very much for your comments. With regard to the first question, the phase-out of nuclear is set for 2022. And indeed, this in a long-term projection, until, let's say, the middle of the century, it's all supposed to be 100% renewable. But don't forget the efficiency issue here. That of course, it's very huge. We need huge efficiency gains in transport, for the housing insulation, and in manufacturing. So the technology is all there. It's just a big issue of social innovations also to prepare the society and the economic actors for this. With regard to Amar's point, yes, of course, this, let's say, deep decarbonization, it's tremendous. It's an unbelievable challenge, also for advanced economies, but even more so for developing countries. I think the big thing is about technology, and we have to rethink. That was mentioned yesterday about the intellectual property rights. We need a new regime for these kind of products and technologies which are directly relevant for the global public good. And then, of course, we need the funding, and advanced economies have to provide major funding and resources made available for this.
Ritu, why is there not much of a public discourse on the move to renewables and getting away from, as Amar pointed out?
No, I won't dispute that there shouldn't be much more debate around that, and I, for one, am a great one of agreeing completely on the need for that. In fact, some of the recent work we've done at, looking at where we are headed with the plans for going towards a 1.5 billion ton coal mining and use through subcritical coal-based power plants, supercritical coal-based power plants, vis-a-vis also ramping up renewables, at least in the short term, is completely, sort of depicting that we are likely to land up with a lot of unnecessary stranded assets. And that's something which is extremely revealing. So on one hand, while one is saying that you need to ramp up your economic growth and create that absorptive capacity in the short term to also sort of have the demand generated within people and within the economy to be able to grow. At the same time, I do think there is a very big need to look at our current plans of what we are planning to put up with regard to coal-based generation as well. Because again, as we are able to ramp up our renewable-based capacities, maybe we do not need as much of the coal-based capacity. That said, we cannot do away with not having any fossil-based capacities, and to that extent, the 40% renewables is quite a large target. So the only point I'm trying to make is that the faster we can ramp up and the faster globally we can move ahead in terms of having the costs of renewables come down, having solutions in terms of the operational aspects of the intermittency problem, the grid problem being handled, the better it is for a country like India, and the better our transition can be managed in moving to a cleaner trajectory. And us not having to rely so much on coal, lock ourselves into so much of investment in infrastructure on coal, which could eventually become redundant capacity.
Anita, would you like to respond to any of the points made?
No, I think the questions are very valid, but we are really grappling with the huge need for connecting 240 million, so access in India itself. And if you look at Africa, it's 2 out of every 3 people who do not have access to electricity. And if you just stop for a moment and think what that means in terms of access to education, healthcare, productive work, the ability to have industrial growth, it's huge. So I think where I would put my money or focus as a G20 group is really on fast-tracking technologies. So for example, carbon capture and use is an area where there hasn't been much focus. And in fact, one of the carbon capture projects that was the model in UK for $1 billion was shut down and closed out because UK took the view that, they're going to phase out coal. But the question for growth markets, emerging countries, is that can you have the kind of high share of renewables in a system where you don't have enough of the kind of grid resilience and grid stability that you need? I think the other area which really needs to be looked at is hybrids. And when I was in the World Bank, we were looking at, for example, can you combine solar and hydro? Hydro, again, a renewable source of energy, but one, because of the environmental and resettlement aspects, we've stayed away from. India, again, has huge untapped hydel capacity, but this is something which is not being discussed. In coal, and this is the final point I'd like to make, is that often there's this knee-jerk reaction against efficient coal and cleaner coal, but what's the counterfactual? You're basically saying that people will have less access to electricity, and both in terms of the coping costs, the impact is the hardest on the poorest. Secondly, in terms of emissions, the alternatives like diesel, kerosene, etc., are much worse than supercritical coal, for example. So I think one has to be practical, but at the same time look at what are we locking ourselves into. And there I come to Amar's point of debate. Rather than posturing, often I find that we all divide ourselves into camps, the renewable flag wavers and the fossil fuel flag wavers, the developing country point of view. I don't think it has to be like that. I really think we need to focus on where can we have the biggest impact. And if you look at India's advantage, as Ritu mentioned the LED story, if India were to go into distributed solar with solar home systems, we could change the cost curve of solar home systems. We are talking about at least 10 million solar home systems. The development of DC appliances, the ability to pay through your cell phones, which we have about 1 billion in India. These are all areas where I think we can make huge strides. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anita. I promised that there'd be another round, so very quickly, we'll take, Anupam had a question, and there was one more back there? No? Okay, Anupam, and there's this one.
Okay. Anita's last intervention suggests that we should connect the dots. So I have my question actually connect certain dots. The point that Thomas's thing, what you described, in answer to the first question, Hans Werner Sim, who's a very renowned economist, somewhat down to earth, but skeptical about politically correct stuff, has a devastating critique a month ago on the German plans, where he basically pointed out that phase out of nuclear will either involve coal, the pumped storage or storage necessity of having the renewable targets was so great that's infeasible. So Germany has a very severe problem going ahead. There's an NBER paper last week which he lays it out in detail. I think that's a lesson very critical for India. We have a similar problem. In the interest of maximizing our renewables, we have totally neglected, for example, the point that Amar was actually alluding to, which is gas. There is no way we can do what we want on renewables unless we address a couple of the things that Anita mentioned and a fuel mix. That's the connecting of the dot. What is G20 doing about these things? Because these are cutting across all of them, and that's where the lesson might be interesting. I'd just like to add one more thing. We all jump again on the issue of distribution and access and coal and access. The fact is the supercritical and all the big coal production that is being done is not contributing at all to the access to the 300 million who are not connected. We have villages are connected, but most of the people in those villages are not connected. So it's not at all clear that the thermal strategy is actually addressing that access issue. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do coal, but that's 40% that we are talking about non-renewables in India actually includes hydro and nuclear. Now, if you look at the time frame that we are talking about, it's any realistic time frame or even optimistic time frame talks about 15 years where you will have any discernible addition or in that. When you put the numbers together, you find that they just don't add up. And I think that's the problem that a lot of developing countries are facing, and all the G20 and other multilateral initiatives tend to go and, the fad of the month or the fad of the year, and in the process, they are distorting a coherent strategy in most of the countries. And I think countries such as India should actually do it more coherently and perhaps teach the Germans what they need to do.
Okay. Yes, there's a question back there, and then I'll come back to
One
you.
of the problems
please
regarding use
identify yourself?
My name is T.C. Ranganathan. I'm a former banker. One of the problems regarding use of hydro as a major source of renewables are issues relating to land acquisition and resettlement. Solar is right now is infancy, and mostly low intensity use has been so far been done. I think Germany is a leader with 20%, reaching 20%. All other countries are much below. If you go for large solar, I wonder if anyone has lived next to a solar park. Is it livable being near a solar park? What will be the impact on habitation, on land, these things, on what do you call other aspects like will it same issues not come up for solar? You are talking in terms of 30, 40 onward percentages. When wind came up, what was the impact of like living under big wind parks? You still have very limited wind. So when you're talking in terms of terabytes, that question no one has ever talked about. I just wanted some ideas on that. Thank you.
Thanks, TC. So one last question here. May I request you to please be brief?
Dr. Thomas, recently
Could you identify yourself?
Dr. Sarjeet Dudeja, don't you think this because of Chernobyl and Fukushima, there is a panic and some lobbies are trying to against it. It's not the fault of this nuclear plant. It was the aging, which was beyond that's happened. In India, we need a lot of nuclear energy, which is a clean, non-carbon. And now there's a lobby, they call this a carbon or non-carbon instead of nuclear, which is a non-carbon. So why not to initiate nuclear energy in such a large extent? We can have to great extent to villagers so that most of the people which are being deprived, they should also get the same facilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll proceed in the reverse order this time. Ritu?
Okay, also going back in the reverse order with regard to questions. I think, again, India, or to that matter, I think most developing countries, we don't have a single bullet kind of a choice. So if we are looking at, what is needed, and as was pointed out earlier by the panel as well, nuclear, hydro, etc., these are all very much things which need to be part of the solution. Nobody's counting it out. But despite whatever can be done with regard to moving forward, and each of these fuels also have their related challenges, there's a certain limited amount which would be available and which would be possible by nuclear or hydro as well. And to that extent, coming back to the access side of the story, I think renewables really need to play a larger role eventually, whether you look at it from any dimension, whether it's an energy security dimension and through the centralized grid, or solving the problem through the decentralized angle. So I think the bottom line really is to push ahead on all kinds of technologies, be innovative in terms of being able to adopt whatever you can and which best suits the context in the various perspectives. So if it's electrifying villages or providing energy at remote locations, I think decentralized is the way to go, and that's where we need to look at how we can bring down the costs, how we can scale up the kind of efforts out there, etc.
Anita, would you?
Well, as someone who was brave enough to finance decentralized power, both biomass, solar, it's very tough to scale up. So I think if we really do want to scale up decentralized, and I agree very much with Anupam's point that, for the villages of India, for example, that's the kind of solution we need. But where's the business model? Where's the revenue going to come? Who's going to finance it? Banks are scared to finance even discoms as off-takers, let alone villagers, dispersed in a village. So I think that's really where we have to come up with maybe government intervention on the infrastructure that's needed, but service providers who come from the private sector. Aggregating demand so that you get the scale, so that bankers and equity investors get more interested to come in and finance these.
Thanks. Thomas?
I'll start with the nuclear issue first. I mean, here it's very obvious. I will not get into the debate because it's huge. It's been with my life story over the last 2 or 3 decades. I can have a very quick answer here. I mean, German society made a collective decision to get out of nuclear, so that's it. I mean, no doubt about it. You can think about it what you like, but for Germany, society, it's clear. With regard to the energy transition now, of course, it's huge. It's a huge challenge. I think it can be done. The technologies are there. The funding is there. The question is if the government is implementing the proper policies to really make the transition smoothly now. We have all the potential is there. You know, with the wind, it's an issue offshore, onshore. The issue is with the transmission lines through Germany. Photovoltaic, it's an issue of the incentives. And here, of course, there is a lot of criticism about current government policies. But personally, from what I can see, I don't see any problems. We'll go through with it with a little bit of hiccups and some irritation, but we'll get this done. And you can watch it. It's an experiment, a globally watched experiment.
Thank you. Thank you, all the panelists. I think this has been a very rich discussion, and lots of ideas have been generated. Let me just say one thing before we... Of course, technology is a known unknown in all of this, and how it will evolve, one doesn't know. But, you know, to Amar's point about the willingness or unwillingness to have a discourse of India's energy policy, I think there has been a discourse. Of course, the discourse can be deepened. The willingness to have a discourse on an energy strategy for India, I think the way I read Indian policy is that there is willingness to deepen that discourse, but not independently of history. So within the context of history, to have a deeper engagement on our energy strategy. There is a willingness to certainly do that. And I think this is a point that was made yesterday as well in the context of both, I think, financial as well as technological transfer. So in the context of history, and I think it's important and it's critical that we have the discourse. Otherwise, as Amar says, we might be shooting ourselves in the foot. So I think this has been a very good, thank you, discussion. Thank you to the audience for engaging, the panelists who've done a marvelous job. So the only thing that we need to do is now to applaud them. So thank you, and just a few housekeeping announcements. We finished this session in just over an hour, which was the time allocated to it because we started 10 minutes late. So if you don't mind, if you could hold on and forego your tea and coffee break, we will give you lunch after the next session. So if you could kind of, a desperate need for coffee or to go to the restroom. So within 5 minutes, we'll organize the transition to the next panel. Please come back with your tea or coffee in the next 5 minutes to the table. Thank you.
Oh,